The camera was already rolling. That's the part nobody remembers correctly. 41 crew members were at their stations on Stage 7 at Republic Pictures, Burbank, California. The arc lights had been burning for 22 minutes. The director, Andrew V. McLaglen, was standing 12 feet behind the Mitchell BNC camera, script pages folded in his left hand, watching the door at the far end of the sound stage. Watching it, not speaking, not calling cut, just watching. The door opened, and the man who walked through it, the man the entire production of McLintock had spent 3 days waiting for, walked in sideways. Not through injury, not through any physical cause that a doctor could have written on a form. He walked in sideways because the world had gone sideways for him somewhere between his dressing room and that door, and his body was simply trying to keep pace with the angle of things. The room went silent. Not out of respect. Not from awe. 41 people went completely still because they had seen this before. Twice before, on days 2 and 7 of principal photography. And every one of them knew that what happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether this picture finished on schedule, over budget, or not at all. John Wayne was standing at his mark. He had been standing at his mark for 22 minutes. He had not complained. He had not sent anyone to check on the situation. He had simply stood at his mark, 6 feet 4 inches, 220 pounds, in a dusty cavalry shirt and worn canvas trousers, and waited. His arms were loose at his sides. His eyes were tracking the door. And when the door opened, and the man came through it sideways, those eyes didn't change expression at all. This is that story. By the autumn of 1962, Republic Pictures' lot on Ventura Boulevard in Burbank was operating at the compressed, combustible energy of a studio that knew every production was a negotiation between art and arithmetic. McLintock, a sprawling, big-budget Western comedy based loosely on Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, was Republic's largest undertaking of the year. The budget had been set at $2. $1 million. The shooting schedule was 43 days. The cast included Maureen O'Hara, Yvonne DiCarlo, and a supporting ensemble that the producers had assembled with the specific intention of surrounding John Wayne with performers capable of matching his screen weight. One of those performers had 26 years of professional credits to his name. He had worked in live theater in Chicago and New York before migrating west. He had appeared in 11 studio pictures and held the kind of supporting actor reputation that casting directors described with words like reliable and textured. The precise vocabulary used for a man who makes every scene he's in better without ever threatening to steal the picture from its lead. He was 5 feet 10 inches, built with the compact solidity of a former collegiate wrestler, and he had a face that the camera genuinely loved. Lined without being aged, expressive without being theatrical. On paper, he was exactly what the role required. Off paper, he was fighting something that had nothing to do with the script. The problem was not new. People in the industry knew about it the way people in any tight professional community know things. Not from documents, not from announcements, but from the quiet, sideways conversations that happened between takes, between setups, in the narrow corridors between stages. A prop master on a previous production. A script supervisor who had worked with him in 1959. A second assistant director who mentioned, without flourish, that mornings were fine but afternoons could be complicated. McLaglen had been warned. He was 35 years old, making one of his first significant studio pictures, and he had been told by 2 separate producers that the situation was manageable, that the man was a professional, that it wouldn't be a problem. Day 2 proved that assessment optimistic. Call time that morning had been 7 a.m. for the full company, with the scene in question, a confrontation in the exterior town square, scheduled as the first setup of the day. The actor arrived at 7:45. When he arrived in the particular condition that the crew had begun referring to in the coded language that sets develop as not quite. Not incapacitated. Not belligerent. Simply not quite where a working actor needed to be at 7:45 in the morning when 40 people were waiting and arc lights were burning money by the minute. McLaglen called a holding pattern. The scene was pushed. The afternoon went forward with a different setup, and the production lost 3.5 hours. The studio absorbed it. These things happened. Day 7 was worse. This time it was not morning. This was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in the middle of a scene that required the actor to hold a sustained 4-minute dialogue exchange. He knew his lines. That was the bewildering part. He knew his lines with the precision of a man who had been doing this since 1936, because he had been doing this since 1936. The problem was the spaces between the lines. The moments when the camera held on his face while another actor spoke. In those moments, something drifted. Something went slightly out of focus, not in the lens but in the man himself, and every person on that set felt it without being able to point to a single frame and say, "There. That is the exact frame." McLaglen called cut. Spoke quietly with the first assistant director. Requested a 30-minute break. The actor went back to his dressing room. The production absorbed another 2 hours. That night, in the production office, 3 producers sat around a folding table with the shooting schedule between them and had the conversation that nobody on a picture wants to have. Do we replace him now at cost, or do we manage the situation and hope? The math was real. Replacing a supporting player 8 days into production meant reshooting footage already in the can, renegotiating a contract, and absorbing a delay that the schedule had no room for. Managing the situation meant continuing to hold patterns, continued lost hours, and the possibility, the genuine, documented possibility, that the whole arrangement would eventually break down in a way that no amount of creative scheduling could contain. They chose to manage it. John Wayne had not been in that meeting. John Wayne had said nothing about days 2 or 7. Not to McLaglen. Not to the producers. Not to Maureen O'Hara, who was watching all of this from a careful distance and whose opinions, on a Wayne production, carried real weight. Wayne had simply shown up at his mark each morning, done his work at the level he always worked, and moved on to the next setup. His silence on the subject was not ignorance. Every person on that set understood that his silence was a form of watching. He had been watching, taking the measure of the situation. And somewhere between day 7 and day 9, he had made a decision that nobody else on the production had been willing to make. There are men who take up a lot of space in a room by talking. John Wayne took up the same amount of space when he said nothing at all. He was 55 years old in the autumn of 1962. The face that every person on the Republic lot recognized had earned its weight. The deep-set eyes, the jaw that seemed to have been cut from the same geography as the landscapes he'd spent 3 decades riding through on film. He had made 143 pictures by that point. He had worked through a collapsed lung, through bursitis in his shoulder that had required a cortisone injection 2 days before the production began, through the accumulated physical taxation of a career that had required him to ride horses, take falls, swing fists, and absorb choreographed punishment at a pace that most stuntmen would have found exhausting. He did not make a performance of any of this. That was the thing about Wayne that the people who worked with him once never forgot, and the people who tried to imitate him always missed. There was no performance to the man's physical presence. The 6 feet 4 inches was not deployed. The 220 pounds was not announced. He simply occupied the space he occupied with a kind of total lack of self-consciousness that registered, somehow, as more commanding than anything theatrical would have been. On stage 7 that morning, the morning of day 9, he had arrived at 6:42 a.m. for a 7 o'clock call. He had spoken with the cinematographer, William H. Clothier, about the first setup. He had reviewed 2 pages of script with McLaglen. He had accepted a cup of coffee from a production assistant, said 2 words of thanks, and moved to his mark. At 7:04 a.m., the first assistant director informed him that his co-star had not yet arrived from the dressing room. Wayne said nothing. At 7:11 a.m., a second check was made. Wayne was still at his mark. His arms were at his sides. His eyes were on the door. A wardrobe assistant standing 15 feet away later recalled. Years later, in an interview she gave for a documentary she never saw aired, that there was something about the way he was standing that she couldn't explain then and couldn't explain 20 years later. It wasn't threat. It wasn't impatience. It was something closer to the way a man stands when he has already decided what he is going to do and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. At 7:26 a.m., the door opened. When the door opened and the figure came through it sideways, the first thing the room registered was not anger. The first thing the room registered was a kind of helpless recognition, the feeling of watching something happen that everyone had been privately bracing for and that nobody had done anything to prevent. The actor made his way toward the set. He was not loud. He was not aggressive. He was, in fact, attempting with visible effort to hold himself in the correct professional configuration, and the effort itself was what made the situation undeniable. A man who did not need to concentrate on walking upright did not concentrate on walking upright. McLaglen took a breath. The first assistant director moved forward, not quite intercepting, not quite confronting, hovering at the edge of intervention the way assistant directors learn to hover, present enough to matter but not positioned in a way that required a decision. And then John Wayne stepped off his mark. In 22 minutes of waiting, he had not moved. He had stood at his mark with the absolute stillness of a man who understood that the camera would find him exactly where he'd been placed, and that any movement was a small erosion of the production's forward motion. He had not paced. He had not made phone calls. He had not sent messages. He stepped off his mark now. He walked across the stage floor at the same pace he always moved. Not slow, not rushed, the particular gait that people who knew him described as a man going somewhere specific who has already calculated the route. The 41 people on that stage registered his movement the way you register a change in air pressure before weather. Not quite consciously, not quite processable, but something in the body that knows before the mind catches up. He reached the actor. The actor looked up at him. In the 3 seconds before Wayne spoke, you could hear the arc lights. You could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling above stage 7. You could hear nothing else, because nobody breathed. Wayne did not speak loudly. He did not point. He did not gesture toward the door or toward the director or toward any of the watching crew. He simply looked at the man in front of him with the same eyes that had tracked that door for 22 minutes and spoke in a voice calibrated for 2 people. He said, "I need you sober. Not tomorrow. Right now." That was the whole of it. No elaboration. No threat that could be documented or denied. No performance of authority. 6 words, spoken with the flatness of a man stating a fact about the weather, in a voice that had been built for exactly this kind of moment. Not the confrontation, but the moment after confrontation was no longer the operative question. The actor stood very still. Not from realization, not yet. From something more immediate and less comfortable. The words had arrived with a weight that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the man who had delivered them. And whatever fog the morning had wrapped around him, something in his animal nervous system had registered the nature of the man he was looking at. McLaglen had not moved. Nobody on stage 7 had moved. But here's where it changes. Wayne didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for acknowledgement or agreement, or even for the other man's eyes to fully focus. He turned and looked at McLaglen with an expression that the director later described as entirely neutral, and he said, "I'll be at my mark. Take as long as you need." And he walked back to his mark. And he stood there. What happened in the next 47 minutes was not dramatic in the sense that anything visible to the camera happened. It was dramatic in the way that the aftermath of a lightning strike is dramatic. Not in the bolt itself, but in everything the bolt illuminated. The actor went back to his dressing room. This time, he did not come out in the same condition he went in. Nobody could say with certainty what happened in that room during those 47 minutes. The dressing room had no windows. The door was closed. What the crew heard faintly through that door and through the ambient noise of a working stage was the sound of water running. Extended. Deliberate. At 8:13 a.m., the door opened again. The man who came through it did not come through it sideways. He walked to his mark. He stood. He looked at McLaglen, and his look was the look of a man who had arrived somewhere, not the look of a man still trying to find his direction. The first assistant director called for positions. The camera operator settled into the eyepiece. William Clothier called his lens adjustment. McLaglen called action. The scene ran. Not perfectly. The edges of it had the slightly deliberate quality of a man working at partial power. But it ran. For minutes and 11 seconds of continuous dialogue without a false stop, without a drift, without the moment when everyone on set begins the careful silent counting that is the professional crew's substitute for holding their breath. When McLaglen called cut, 22 crew members applauded. Not the full company. Not a standing ovation. 22 people, scattered across the stage, who had spent 9 days watching this particular situation develop, and who had just watched something different happen, and who expressed it in the only way available to them in the moment. The actor stood at his mark. He did not look toward the applause. He looked directly at John Wayne, who was standing 12 feet away, and John Wayne looked back, and for 3 seconds, precisely 3, by the account of the script supervisor who was watching the clock as part of her job, neither man moved or spoke. Then Wayne gave a single nod. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Not a declaration of any kind. The kind of nod one working man gives another working man when the work is being done. the nod that contains an acknowledgement with no surplus attached. The actor nodded back. The production moved to the next setup. It was 8:17 a.m. In the years since McLintock wrapped principal photography on November 14, 1962, and completed post-production for its December release. Pieces of what happened on Stage 7 have emerged the way these things emerge from the archaeology of a working film set. In single sentences in memoirs, in footnotes to interviews given for other purposes, in the recollections of crew members who were junior enough in 1962 to still be working in 1982, and who, by then, had the perspective to understand what they'd seen. The picture that emerges is not a story about confrontation in the way the word is usually meant. Wayne was not attempting to correct the actor. He was not issuing a warning. He was not positioning himself as a moral authority over another man's private life, another man's relationship to whatever it was that had brought him to the state he'd been arriving in. He had said 6 words. He had stated a professional requirement in the plainest possible language, with no ornamentation, and then he had walked away and stood at his mark. What he understood, and what took the actor considerably longer to articulate, but which he eventually did, in an interview he gave in 1971, was that there is a specific geometry to how a man takes responsibility for another man's dignity. You do not take it publicly. You do not perform it for a room. You do not make the other man's failure into a story that everyone on the set carries home with them and tells at dinner and adds to the permanent record that follows an actor from picture to picture for the remainder of his career. You state the requirement. You step back. You return to your mark. That's not management. That's a form of respect that is harder to give than the kind that comes with a handshake. The actor spent 8 years after McLintock, working steadily in television and supporting film roles. In 1967, he entered a 30-day treatment program in Pasadena. The first time, he later wrote, that he had ever done anything about the problem rather than simply managing it and managing it and managing it until it became unmanageable. He credited 3 people in the letter he wrote to his family on the night before he entered treatment. His wife, his physician, and a man on a film set who had looked him in the eye and said 6 words without making those 6 words into a performance of another man's virtue. He named Wayne by name. He wrote, he didn't do it for the picture. He did it because he saw a working man who had stopped working, and he said the only thing worth saying, and then he left me alone to either hear it or not. I heard it 5 years later. But I heard it. Years later, more than a decade after McLintock had completed its theatrical run and entered the permanent catalog of Wayne's middle-period westerns. A young television actor visited the treatment program in Pasadena as part of his own journey through the same geography. The man who had walked through that dressing room door sideways in 1962 was, by then, a volunteer counselor. He had been sober for 11 years. He worked with young actors specifically, because young actors, he said, came to the problem the same way he had, convinced that the work would protect them from whatever the work itself was trying to help them avoid. He told the story of Stage 7 to every group he worked with, not as a story about John Wayne, as a story about what it means when someone tells you the truth in the smallest possible number of words and then gives you the dignity of walking away. His students, the people who came through that program and went back to working lives, carried that story into rooms where it was needed. The geometry of it, the 6 words, the walk back to the mark, 1 requirement, no performance, 1 nod when the work got done, return for a moment to Stage 7, 41 people, 22 minutes of waiting. A door at the far end of the sound stage that had the entire room's attention without anyone acknowledging that the room's attention was on it. The question that opened this story was not a complicated question. It was the oldest question on any working set, on any working floor in any profession where the quality of the outcome depends on the quality of the people producing it. What do you do when someone in the room is not in the room? John Wayne answered it the way he answered most things, without drama, without delay, and with the precise minimum of action required to change the situation. He walked across Stage 7. He said 6 words. He walked back to his mark. He didn't moralize. He didn't threaten. He didn't call a meeting or draft a memo or request a conversation with the producers about the future of the production. He identified the requirement. He stated it plainly. He trusted the other man with what happened next. That's the thing history almost missed about that morning. It was not an act of power. It was an act of faith, the specific, difficult faith of a working man in another working man's capacity to hear the truth and act on it, even if the acting on it took 5 years and a letter written the night before a 30-day program in Pasadena. One requirement, one moment of plain speech, one decision to trust the other man with the rest. Some confrontations end with a man on the floor. Some confrontations end with a man at his mark. The ones that end at the mark are the ones worth remembering. But there was one moment on that production, not on stage 7, not in front of 41 people, that John Wayne never spoke about publicly. A conversation that happened after the picture wrapped, in a parking lot on the Republic lot, between only 2 men, with no crew and no cameras and nothing on the record.